um, as they're able. So welcome to the CTS Freight 101 webinar series focused on maritime freight. We have two excellent presenters for you this afternoon, so we're really looking forward to the discussion. So as you may be aware, CTS has focused its 2025 theme on unpacking freight from producers to front doors. And this webinar series, of which this is our second in a series, is our kickoff event for the year. And we just included a link to the website that talks about a little bit more about our thinking for the coming year, and also provides lots of resources, including recordings for these webinars. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available following the conclusion of today's conversation. In addition to this particular webinar, we have three more scheduled. On March 6th, we will be focusing in on aviation topics. March 27th, we'll focus in on rail, and then April 3rd will feature urban delivery and logistics. So really hope that you are able to mark those on your calendar and join us for those webinars. I want to remind, just from a housekeeping standpoint, that as you are thinking of questions during Deb and Catherine's presentations, if you would put those in the Q&A, we will address those at the end of the presentations. We want to make sure that they have enough time to get through their great material, and so we'll hold questions until they both have finished. So with that, I am going to turn to them and let them start their presentation. So our speakers today are Deb DeLuca, who's the Executive Director of the Duluth Seaway Port Authority, and Catherine Sarnecki, who is the Chief Development Officer for the St. Paul Port Authority. Both of them are on the Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee and also serve on the committee's executive committee. And Deb is just finishing up her stint as chair of the group. So really are grateful for their leadership and their involvement with that key committee for Minnesota. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Deb.
Oh, right. I'm going to get my screen pulled over. Can you all see that? I'm going to take that as a yes. Oops, okay.
Yeah,
sorry about
Deb,
that.
I think, yeah, try, yeah.
You can see it or you can't?
Cannot.
Oh, no kidding. Shoot. Okay, excuse me. Now, I need to put it back in slideshow mode. All right. Now you can see it, right? Good. Okay. Well, thank you for having me here this afternoon. I'm excited to talk about maritime freight and to share the stage with my good friend and colleague, Catherine Sarnecki. I'm going to tell you about, there's so much to cover in 20 plus minutes. I'm going to tell you about the waterway first that connects us to the world, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Shipping System. I'm going to move on to our port, the Port of Duluth Superior, and then I'm going to tell you about the work of the Port Authority. And hopefully that will give you enough of a taste. So there are a couple of features of the Port of Duluth Superior that really are key to our success. A couple of geographic features. First of all, we're located very close to the center of the North American continent, only about 400 miles east of that geographic center. And that means that we are perfectly located to serve as a portal for finished goods and raw materials into and out of the North American heartland, including southern Canada. And of course, we also anchor the western terminus, or we are the western terminus of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Shipping System. This is the waterway that connects us to the world. It's takes about a week to get to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, to the mouth of the Atlantic. And then it takes about 15 days to get to Northern Europe in total, and about another couple days to get to the Mediterranean. However, that said, we do traffic comes into and out of this waterway from all over the world. This is a binational waterway. It is, and so it is governed by both the Canada, on the Canadian side, it's a privatized entity that is under contract to Department, or Transport Canada. And on the US side, it's a sub-agency of the US Department of Transportation that governs it. It's also surrounded by 8 states and 2 Canadian provinces. So there's a lot of opportunity for regulatory mismatch. So we work hard with our partners to try to make sure that regulations are well are harmonized. There are 9 sets of locks. We'll back up. I'm going to tell you there's sort of 2 major parts to the waterway. There's the upper 4 Great Lakes. They form sort of one subsystem, and then the St. Lawrence Seaway that is really Lake Ontario to Montreal, and then the rest of it is the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence Seaway component, there are 9 sets of locks along that system. 7 of them are governed by or managed by the Canadians, 2 by the US. And then up here on the upper Great Lakes, the Soo Locks is critical to our Lake Superior shipping. It separates Lake Superior from Lake Huron. There are about 85 US ports along this system, and there's about between 150 and 2 million tons of cargo transit the system every year. There's significant economic impact for the US and Canada that comes out of this system. I should mention that if those 8 states and 2 provinces were their own nation, they'd have the 3rd largest GDP in the world. And the shipping system forms a sort of a base beat for that. This is an area that's rich in natural resources and manufacturing. A significant proportion of the in whole, this is a bulk non-hazardous natural resources port. I'll talk about what moves through or I should say system, but I'll talk about what moves through the system because it's very similar to what moves through our port when we talk about the port. In terms of value, that's about $26 billion worth of goods that pass through the system every year. In terms of just the maritime cargo movements, that represents 36 billion in economic activity each year, and just over 240,000 jobs on the US and Canadian sides. I'd like to point out that moving goods by water, whether it's on the river or on the Great Lakes system, is by far the most environmentally efficient, lowest emission way to do so. And if you take one of our big Great Lakes freighters, there's many ways to describe the efficiency, but I like to do it this way. If you have a ton of cargo you need to move and you have a gallon of fuel, you can move that ton of cargo a little over 600 miles on a Great Lakes freighter, a large ship. In comparison to rail, it's about 1/3 as far, although rail is getting more and more efficient. So let's call it a third to a half as far, but only about 1/10 as far on a truck. That's very significant difference, obviously. And I also will take a moment to point out that one of those 1,000-foot Lakers displaces 2,800 trucks. And hold on to that thought for when we talk about the steelmaking supply chain. There is seasonality to the system, which is very different from ocean ports that are open year-round. However, because of the snow and the ice and the needs to manage that waterway, the St. Lawrence Seaway component, it closes at the end of December and opens at the end of March. It's about a 9.5-month season. And then the Great Lakes, the Soo Locks open at the end of, they open March 25th and close January 15th. So it's about a 10-month season. The 2 entities are trying to, I should say the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers manages the Soo Locks. Those 2 entities, try to kind of move them closer together by the Seaway has been lengthening a little bit, to more closely match the Soo Lock system. But it makes it a little bit of a challenge from a supply chain standpoint. And I'll leave the rest of that explanation for questions if you have them. We see many kinds of vessels that come into our harbor and that come throughout the system. they can roughly be divided into two categories: Lakers, the ones that stay on the Great Lakes or predominantly stay on the Great Lakes, and then the Salties, or the ocean-going vessels. The U.S. Lakers are bigger than the Canadian vessels. They can be up to 1,000 feet long, but the U.S. vessels, there's about 46 of them, stay on those upper four Great Lakes. They cannot pass through the Welland Canal that bypasses Niagara Falls. The Canadian Lakers are 740 feet maximum length, and they do enter into the seaway. And then the Salties, of course, can go all the way across. Some of the smaller class ships, the handy size, can actually transit the entire system and then also enter the riverine system in Europe. So let's move on to the port. This is one of our Salties coming into the harbor with two vessels. It's a gorgeous shot. The port is, well, first of all, the Port of Duluth Superior is the largest port on the Great Lakes by tonnage on the US or Canadian side. We handle about 33 million tons of cargo per year. And it's also a two-state, two-city port, of course, Duluth, Minnesota, Superior, Wisconsin. There's been shipping through this port since the late 1800s. And the Port Authority was only created in the 1950s in advance of the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway System. I only mention that because a lot of ports, there are many port authorities that own all the harbor land or all the docks and lease them out. And every port is different. That's not the case here. We own and operate one terminal in the harbor. But the rest of the terminals, there's about 21 total cargo terminals in the harbor, and the rest of those are privately owned. It is a bulk non-hazardous natural resources port. Trying to think of what else I want to tell you before I move on. And again, we'll talk about cargoes in an instant. A port cannot be a successful port without excellent landside connections. I see I have an out-of-date slide here. We're served by 4 Class I railroads at the port, which is unusual. Ports are, consider themselves lucky if they are served by 2. This just means more competitive rail rates, basically. But this is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, Canadian National. That should be Canadian Pacific / Kansas City Southern, and then the Union Pacific Railroad. And then we are also served by free-flowing, uncongested highways. Really notably, Interstate 35 connects right down to Mexico, like through Texas all the way to Mexico. And then US 53 and 2 are critical. And so, of course, you can get those vessels, you can get the cargo into the port, but you need to get it to its final destination on land. We'll take a moment well, you know what? I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time and tell you that what we see in this port, just like the system, bulk, non-hazardous natural resources cargo is what predominates. For our port in particular, iron ore is absolutely king. It makes up 55% of our tonnage. I will say we have the largest coal dock on the Great Lakes, and it was built in about mid-70s. And from that time in the mid-70s up until about 2010, it would often compete with iron ore for that #1 spot. We used to see about 20 million tons of coal move through this harbor. And now it's down to less than 6 million tons. And that's just because the market for coal is going away, as we know. And that also means that our total tonnage will continue to drop. There was one point in time I don't know if it was right around World War II or slightly before, where Port of Duluth Superior actually duked it out with New York, New Jersey for being the largest tonnage port in the United States. Anyway, we're not going to do that with it, point is, coal's going away. Limestone is our #3, and limestone is used for many different things. The limestone that comes through this port, it's used to make the taconite pellets for steel production. It's used for construction of purposes. And then we have a special class called sugarstone that comes through our port and goes to the sugar beet facilities in western Minnesota. It's where it's turned the sugar, it's helped to produce sugar, to process them into sugar. And then the beet pulp pellets actually come back through our port and are exported as a high quality animal feed. Grain is our #4. in terms of tonnage, cargo, but it is our #1 export. We see, in addition to those beet pulp pellets, that what you see predominantly is spring and durum wheat. We are a big source for spring and durum wheat going to the Mediterranean area. It's sought after, highly sought after for pasta and bread making. It comes from as far east as eastern Montana, and then of course all the way through to Minnesota. That other category includes other dry bulks like cement and salt and fertilizer, but also the cargo that comes through our terminal, which is the general and break bulk cargo, which we'll talk about in a bit. This is just another way of looking. This is actually our 2024 cargo totals. We just finished up our season on January 15th. It's just another depiction, but you can see we're usually over 30 million tons. We were slightly under this year. Of course, with that coal going away, we probably won't. We may not stay above 30 million tons. So I always like to emphasize when we're talking about the port and water to take this opportunity to tell you, to remind everyone that our state and our port are absolutely critical in the nation's steel making supply chain. And of course, we all consume steel, whether we recognize it or not. We build out, we needed to build out our electrical grid. It's in our cars, it's in our appliances, it's in everything we do, really, your buildings. But 85% of the iron ore that goes into virgin steel making or first pour steel making, however you want to call it, comes out of Minnesota's Iron Range. It moves through one of 3 ports on Lake Superior, Duluth Superior, Two Harbors, or Silver Bay, and it moves on vessel to get to the steel making facilities on the lower lakes. The backhaul is generally limestone, but it can be other bulks as well. So this is where I mentioned, if those vessels did not move, that would all have to be transported by rail and by truck, and there really just isn't enough capacity. And I also want you to think about all those 2,800 trucks for each vessel passing through the Chicagoland Nexus. If you've ever been through there at rush hour, vessels remove congestion from our highways. The harbor naturally has about an 8-foot depth. However, the ships that come into the harbor are around 26, 27 feet in depth when they're loaded. And so this harbor's been dredged for a long time. And it's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that's responsible for the dredging. They move between 100 and 110,000 cubic yards of dredge material every year. Now, the Port Authority is the local sponsor for that activity, and we actually own a reuse facility in the middle of the map here called Erie Pier. It used to be called a contained disposal facility. The material is clean. We test it all the time. And so we really use it as a reuse facility. For the past, over 10 years now, almost all the material has been, most of it's been directly reused for either habitat improvement projects, for the area of concern cleanup habitat projects, and for beach nourishment. So we are always work to help get that permitted, to help with permitting, and to help find reuse opportunities for the Army Corps. We like to say that the port is part of your everyday life. We move the raw materials that you use in your everyday life, whether it's that pasta. This is actually when that pasta, the wheat goes across through our port over to Italy, gets made into pasta and put in these blue boxes. And when you buy it off your grocery store shelves, you can remember this story. The cement that is used in construction of buildings and sidewalks, there's a cement terminal that's a tenant of the Port Authorities. They send cement as far away as Alberta, and it comes from Turkey for the most part. Of course, obviously, steel for your automobiles and appliances. The Port Authority, carries the wind turbine equipment that generates power and a clean power for your use. Of course, salt that goes on your roadways and water softeners, and the sugar that gets the processing of the sugar that we mentioned earlier. The port has a large economic impact. It really has been an economic driver for the region since the late 1800s. This is this economic impact slide. The data comes from the 2022 shipping season, which was not even one of our best seasons. However, the maritime cargo movements represent $1.6 billion of economic activity in the region, about $215 million in tax revenue, and represent over 7,000 jobs supported in the region. Honestly, Duluth would not be Duluth if the shipping if the shipping had not been established here and didn't occur here. We'd probably be something more like Grand Marais. And now that brings us to the Port Authority. We are an economic development entity created in, as I said, the mid-50s in advance of the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway that happened in 1960. That was by the way, that was the St. Lawrence Seaway system was one of the points of pride of the Eisenhower administration. Anyway, the Port Authority has a mission. We bring business to the port, economic development to the region, and we advocate at the local, state, and federal levels for maritime transportation, freight, and industry. We do get a tax levy from the county, but we generate most of our own revenues through cargo handling, leasing, and warehousing. We own I'll talk about the terminal we own in just a second. And I'll just say that we're governed by a board. The board has appointees from the governor, from the Duluth City Council, and from the St. Louis County Board of Commissioners. This is our Clear Public Marine Terminal. We own other land that we lease in Duluth, a lot of it down here on Rice's Point, but this is our most important piece of property. It is operated, we have an agent that is contracted to us, long-term partner since 1991. They share our mission. And so we own the assets and they operate them in a way that's consistent with our mission. We're in contact with them daily. In any event, they operate this as a multimodal logistics hub. So not only do we have 8 deep sea shipping berths, we have about 500,000 square feet of warehouse right here on the terminal, 40 acres of outdoor storage space. We're served by 4 Class 1 railroads right at our terminal, which again, very competitive rail rates, trucker services, including a scale. So it's got a lot going on, and we use this in order to, our goal in operating this is to provide flexible supply chain solutions for our regional industries so that they can be globally competitive. And I really credit our agent with that, that capability with our support. We brand this working partnership as Duluth Cargo Connect. That's how we're marketed worldwide. From a maritime perspective, which is what I'm going to focus on, this is what you see at our port. You see these huge pieces of equipment that are lifted with, at our terminal. You see these huge pieces of equipment that are lifted with cranes. And these are, by the way, our iconic gantry cranes that were made here in Duluth in the 1950s. They're electric. So we were cool and electric way ahead of our time, at least on that aspect. Anyway, this is a big pressure vessel. I think it went to Alberta for a gas plant. And over here, these are generators that went to Amazon, one of the Amazon warehouses in the cities. We are also the #1 terminal on the Great Lakes for wind equipment, wind turbine equipment. You can see in this picture, the blades, the blades, which get longer and longer every year, the towers, the nacelles, the power heads, all of this comes through our port, our terminal. And it is logistically challenging to get them onto the road, but we credit our partnership with the U.S. Department, with MnDOT. They are just excellent partners, and our city folks, but especially MnDOT really is on top of the oversized, overweight freight movement department. So can't spend more time on that one, sorry. We do carry maritime containers. We are only one of 2 ports on the Great Lakes, U.S. ports, I think, on the Great Lakes to do so, and that the other one is Cleveland. And we are working with our Great Lakes partners to add others, because getting a critical mass of containers into the port and having various nodes to drop them off and pick them up is sort of critical to having the system be visible as a container system. We added this capability actually in 2022, and then in 2023, we added a liner service, a direct liner service. This is with a Dutch vessel company called Spleethof that anyway, it traveled the liner service. It's on a regular basis. It's on a monthly basis. It's sort of that less than truckload concept. Companies can send, they don't need to charter a whole vessel. They can send as much as they want, general cargo or containers. So it's very reliable. It's been very successful. In fact, we were able to add a secondary liner service this year coming out of the Mediterranean. It's not quite monthly, but it's very regular. So, oops, sorry. This is the catchment area for our terminal. And actually we could extend this out to the Pacific Northwest with that liner service. We see cargo coming as far away as the Pacific Northwest and going out to say about as far as Alberta in terms of what's outbound. And finally, I want to we really, I mentioned the modal flexibility. It is our strength. We are able to flex between modes. And I'll tell you one brief story, which is that just to illustrate this, we have a customer manufacturing customer who's south of the Twin Cities. They could not get containers during COVID. So they were not able to bring in their goods that came in from whether it was Montreal, they have some that comes in from Canada, but Turkey, all over the world, really. So our agent helped them charter a vessel. They filled the vessel with super sacks of their material and brought it in to our terminal. To this day, they use the maritime option. So they're adding resiliency to their supply chain and flexibility. So again, that's just one of many stories. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kat and wait for your questions to expand on anything else. But thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks for sharing about the Seaway. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. It's asking me which one to share. Okay. Can you see?
Yes.
Trying to get it in slideshow mode. There we go. All right, thank you. Again, Catherine Sarnicki. I am the Chief Development Officer for the St. Paul Port Authority. My order is a little different than Deb's, but covering most of the same topics. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Port Authority, then a little bit about the Mississippi River system, show you a little bit about our local terminals, and then tell you about some of the challenges that are ongoing. So we'll dive into it. You know, one of the reasons St. Paul is where it is because of the Mississippi River. This is downtown St. Paul. We have barges going through there every day. This photo is actually taken from our harbor operator, the ones who dispatch the barges. I call them ballet of the river. They barges.
We can't see your screen is not in presenter mode. Sorry. We can see river shipping in Minnesota, but it doesn't seem to be moving.
Oh. I apologize. Thank you. It changed to which screen? Let me see. Thank you for telling me. I'm going to try sharing this screen, see what happens. Now do you see beautiful barges in St. Paul?
That's great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for helping me with that. So St. Paul is where it is because of the river and the steamboats that came up, and that's why people settled here. So we love St. Paul. A little bit about the St. Paul Port Authority. Here we go. Similar to the Duluth Seaway Port Authority, we are an economic development agency, and we say we provide conduit to quality job opportunities, expand the tax base, advance sustainable and equitable development, and advocate for river commerce. And similar to Deb, really work with the industrial users in St. Paul and region-wide to help get commodities in and out of the cities, and also do different business development items. So we were started in 1929. The Minnesota legislature established St. Paul Port Authority as a nonprofit governmental agency to manage the harbor. So we are separate from the city of St. Paul, but we do have a 7-member board, 2 of whom are city council members, and all of them are selected by the mayor and appointed by city council. So we definitely have heavy ties to the city of St. Paul, although we are a separate agency. 1929, you'll see Mississippi River shipping in the 30s. We'll remember that timeline. But in the 1950s, the legislature authorized port authorities to engage in more economic development activities inland, right? So not necessarily on the port, and provided different financing tools. You know, we can do bonding, we can use tax increment financing, and other tools to help our work of the Port Authority. So in addition to our work on the harbor, we've redeveloped 21 business centers throughout St. Paul, that which has brought 500 businesses. In those business centers, that's over 1,000 acres, over 22,000 jobs, and provides over $38 million to the city in tax revenue. So again, our work on the harbor, we're going to get to. The commercial redevelopment is a big thing. And the third component that we do is statewide programs, most specifically energy efficiency loan programs. The biggest of which are our Trillion BTU loan program, trying to save BTUs. And then we've also coupled that with property assessed clean energy, which allows you to make energy improvements and pay for it through assessments on your taxes over time as you realize the energy savings. So again, lots of loans, over $250 million of investments in energy efficiency, supporting energy savings and jobs. Now to the river, the really fun part. And I have to say, as far as background, before I worked for the Port Authority, I was a water fan, a river fan, a lake fan, ocean fan, but I didn't know anything about river shipping. So apparently you can teach a middle-aged dog new tricks, because I've learned a lot about it, and definitely not the expert, but I'm going to show you some images and definitely borrow from some of the experts at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers here. And this is a little bit older study, but just wanted you to see sort of the breadth of the inland river shipping network, and which states, you know, really benefit from this, and where, you know, the bulk of activity. Like I said, this is very dated info, but it does show that Minnesota, even back in the 90s, had over $1 billion worth of commodities going through our river system. So the Mississippi River Basin is huge. We are located very north in that country. And so to be sort of in the middle of this landlocked country and to have not just the Seaway Port Authority system, but to have the Mississippi River system as well, it is really amazing and an incredible resource. The river really started around agriculture in the 1930s. Congress authorized the lock and dam system. There are 25 locks and dams from here to St. Louis. South of St. Louis, there are not any locks and dams, but it also, the dams help control the water. So Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to maintain a 9-foot navigation channel. So I get a little jealous when Deb talks about 26-foot depth vessels, because I think about how much more product we could move. But on the river system, the barges can draft up to 9 feet deep. It is a lot of locks and dams to get through, to get from St. Paul to New Orleans. I think average time is roughly around 10 days. A little bit of navigation statistics. We also are very seasonal in nature. Typically, the season ends around Thanksgiving, early December. And then the first of the season usually depends on if lock maintenance is finished. Then it's who wants to break through the ice on Lake Pepin first to open up the official season up here in Pool 2. Again, looking at this is Upper Mississippi, some of the statistics, but we'll show you some more local photos. I know this isn't a view I get to see very often, and I had to double check. This is Lock and Dam 2 in Hastings, and I have only really get to see it from the land side. So I think this is a cool view up in the air. But the Lock and Dam system really allows for that 9-foot navigation system, and pools of water. Basically, it creates a step system for the barges to get down the river. And allows us to maintain a minimum pool depth within above each lock and dam. So here's an example of lock and dam. I believe it's 10, but most of the locks on the Upper Mississippi are 600-foot long locks and dams. And typical barge, here you can see we've got 15 barges pushed by one towboat, and they have to split it. So they bring the first 12 barges through, they lock them, then they cut it off, and here you're seeing the second 6 and the boat coming through. So it does take about 2 hours to get through a 600-foot lock versus depending on if there's a backup, maybe only 20 minutes on a 1,200-foot lock. So that's one of the components we have here. Here in St. Paul, this is one of our facilities in our Red Rock terminal. I'll give you an overview map, but I really just wanted to talk about some of the commodities and why river shipping is important and what we do. And on the Mississippi, agriculture is king. Corn, soybeans are huge, and fertilizer coming up the river and grain going down was really, when they established the shipping channel back in the 30s and 40s, was really how the system was established to allow Midwest farmers to get their products all over the world. So similar to Deb, I like to show the graphic of efficiency based on mode. And so one 15 barge tow, so one boat moving 15 barges carries the same equivalent of 2 unit trains or over 1,000 semi-trailer trucks. And similar to Deb, we need the multimodal system, but that if we can take all those trucks off the road and save wear and tear, I know MnDOT would be a lot happier if they didn't have to do quite so much maintenance on the highway system. And again, these numbers, Deb will have to compare numbers on the Seaway because this is the same ton-mile traveled per gallon of fuel. And these say we're going a little bit further, but they say rail and truck go a little bit further as well. But definitely the least amount of friction to move commodities is, on the water. Rail is definitely better than truck, but it means lower emissions, less congestion on the freeways. Okay, so what's moving on the river? And I say imports here, that's in and out of our terminals, not necessarily from international sources. One of the things on the Mississippi River is that if you're getting product from overseas, it goes from, say, Turkey with cement. It goes from Turkey to the Gulf of Mexico, where things then get transloaded onto barges and then sent up the river. So most everything from our river, there's salt and other materials that come along the river, but any of the international products get transloaded onto barges from the ocean going vessels. Cement is huge. Semstone is here. They tell me that cement is the #2 most consumed quantity in the world behind water. And when I stop and think about, cement can be in a house, in a building, in a driveway, a concrete kennel, a retaining wall, all the things that we use cement for. I can see how it's right there behind water. Salt, and typically we're talking road salt, If it's coming in bulk in the barges, it's not for human consumption at that point. If it wants to be in human consumption, it has to go in those super sacks or some other containerized piece of transportation to maintain human consumption quality. But road salt, we get a lot of it. It really depends on the winter. There was a winter a few years ago where MnDOT was running low on salt and all the cities were running low on salt. And the demand for salt was high, and the next spring, if we didn't get requests from all of our tenants to say, how can we set up a salt pad? How can we manage salt in our terminal? The demand is way more than it's ever been. So the weather definitely affects the patterns on what's going on there as well. Also coming up, sand and gravel. Those are huge and big heavy products to take off the roads. Sand and gravel are actually one of the only items we have for a local haul. So Aggregate Industries, now Wholesome, has a aggregate mine down in Cottage Grove on Gray Cloud Island, and they barge all their aggregate up to our barge terminal 1 right off of Warner Shepherd Road. And most of that aggregate goes to their neighbor Semstone to make concrete. So we have a lot of the concrete mixes coming from there. The other big items of what's coming in are fertilizers, different times, most of them nitrogen fertilizers, but phosphorus and magnesium a little bit as well. And coal, as Deb said, coal is still out there, but it is declining as the use declines in our country as well. And exports, again, this is going out of the Twin Cities. To get overseas, we have to send it back to the Gulf of Mexico and have it transloaded back into ocean vessels. But number 2, yellow corn is our highest commodity. Soybeans is very high as well. The amount of corn that we used to ship out was probably close to 2 to 3 times as much before ethanol production started. And now a lot of our corn product goes into ethanol production as well. So other feed products, there's molasses, dried distiller grains, wheat through here as well, although Duluth definitely gets more wheat and we get more corn and soybeans. And then we do actually get some fertilizers that come down from Canada on rail and get transloaded onto the river to go to other parts of the country. And mostly that's potash from Canada. So you've heard a lot of me talking. I'm going to see if I can get this video to work. It's only just over a minute, and hopefully the sound will work.
I don't think anything is more important to agriculture than logistics and transportation. That's ultimately how we get that product to the ultimate end customer, and our waterways have been absolutely critical in that effort. Waterways are really the backbone spine of our overall grain logistics system. We've got to keep up maintenance. We've got to keep up modernization of our locks and dams on the major waterways that contribute to such a large percentage of our exports.
Waterways have been our one advantage. The cheapest transportation in the world is on the water. It isn't in truck, it isn't in rail, and environmentally, it has less of an impact than any of those other modes of transportation, so we should all be behind rebuilding our waterway infrastructure.
Competitors around the world understand that water transport is very efficient and some of the most cheap transportation logistics they can have. Fortunately, we've got a great drainage system here in the United States through the heartland of production that allows us to do that. But it's critical to keep the infrastructure up, to modernize it, and to understand the value of it. I think our waterways have helped keep the American producer and the American exporter at the top of the list.
Okay, so hopefully that came through. Okay, I'm not seeing it advance. There we go to my next slide. So that talks about the impact of the river sort of on a national level. But even on a local level, right? The barges come up in 12 or 15 barge tows to St. Paul, and then they get broken up. Like I say, the valet brings them to the users. But just to give you an idea of local impact, in 2018, Upper River Services, our barge operator, moved over 3,000 barges from St. Paul to Savage, Minnesota, on the St. Mississippi, and then here at Fort Snelling is the split to the Minnesota River. That's over 200,000 semi trucks worth of mostly fertilizer and grain products going back and forth. And imagine if we had to try and transport that from folks. It's really great. Folks from the western part of the state and southern part of the state can bring products to Savage and get them on the river. There's also terminals in Red Wing and Hastings, Red Wing and Winona as you go south. So Minnesota farmers really have great access to the river. This is the Mississippi River through St. Paul. So Duluth, you saw the shipping terminal was all sort of congregated in that one area near the port. Here in St. Paul, it's quite spread out. So this is where you saw the initial picture looking into downtown from this area where our barge operator works out of. This blue area is our barge terminal number 1. This is our Southport River Shipping Terminal and our Red Rock Shipping Terminal. So we have found and created some areas sort of off the main channel here to keep active, to allow for river shipping to be more popular here in St. Paul. Just to give you a scope of materials, we're not nearly as big as Duluth Superior. So we're in the $5 to $8 million tonnage coming through St. Paul. We have 21 tenants. We do not operate our own facilities or have direct partnerships like Duluth. We instead lease the land and then partner with them to make investments in the property and promote river shipping. But those sites also generate tax revenue and are lots of great jobs in St. Paul. Okay, here's a little bit of my summary slide. I know it's a bunch of words, but this should summarize a lot of the information that we've talked about. The nation's inland waterways, over 12,000 miles, lots of locks, 240 locks throughout the nation. But it's time to reinvest. Those locks were built in the 30s and 40s with 50-year lifespans. They are aging. They need major overhauls. They're constructed with a fantastic design. I say that as a professional civil engineer in Minnesota, using the weight of water to move barges in and up, and just I think it's fantastic. Very valuable commodities. Over the 60% of the country's grain is shipped via the Mississippi River, and huge implications for jobs and product. And here, I think Deb had mentioned there's 8 states along the Great Lakes that ship, and we've got 28 states here. This is a little dated. This is from 2018, and by 2025, we were expected to double. That hasn't happened, but we do see fluctuations in the commodities. The biggest of which right now that I'm trying to track is the effect on tariffs. The last time there were tariffs with China, all the grain, we ship a lot of that number 2 yellow corn to China, and China stopped buying all of America's grain and started buying all their grain from Brazil. So the whole supply chain shifted around. So this is some more information from the Army Corps of Engineers from their St. Paul district. One of the challenges we have is the backlog of maintenance on the system. They break it up between different types of maintenance on the system, but really, the miter gates need to be replaced, those joints. The concrete needs to be making sure that if there's, cracks or things that they're being attached, and then not to mention all the electrical and mechanical items. And if you look at that system wide, We've got a total backlog of over $18 billion on the Mississippi River. And so, you know, the Army Corps has done a good job, I think, of prioritizing and keeping the river open and operational. But really, we need additional funding and full funding for projects. One of the biggest problems on the lock and dam system is that Congress can authorize a project and some spending for the project, but not necessarily for the full project. If the project is going to take 5 years, they can't allocate the whole cost of it. And it's been really hard. They, you know, have difficulty binding future Congresses to spending. And so we're stuck in this 2-year cycle of only getting projects so far within 2 years and having to start and stop again, which makes it even less efficient in building. So I've talked about a few of the challenges facing our industry. Definitely the aging infrastructure is the highest. At the national level, the lock and dam system needs reinvestment. The state level, thank you to MnDOT. MnDOT has a port development assistance program in which we try and get bonding dollars allocated to help facilitate improvements at public ports in Minnesota. Because there's also a lot of local infrastructure that needs to be maintained, those areas where the products are being loaded and unloaded, and bringing rail to those sites and keeping those sites maintained. Another big challenge we have on the Mississippi River is there's times when the river is closed. Seasonality is pretty predictable. Like I said, we know the river is going to be closed December through sometime in March. But really unpredictable lately has been the flooding, right? It used to be predictable spring flooding. It would flood in April. By May, your system was open and going. The last 5 to 10 years, back to 2014, I guess that's over 10 years. We've now been experiencing summer flooding. So June and July flooding. You know, we get through the snow melt in the spring without too much issue. But then the rainfall events are heavy, and the amount of impervious surface we have just drains it all to the river. And so when that river is moving quickly, it carries a lot of sediment. And when the river slows down, all that sediment drops to the bottom of the river, creating conflicts with the barges so that the channel becomes less than 9 feet and they can't move. So dredging is has been a big issue, and we've had to increase the amount of dredging we've done in the last 10 years because of the increased flooding as well. Some other challenges, like I talked about, the tariffs or trade restrictions really do shift the whole global economics of things and how products move around. Farmers and other folks like certainty, and the uncertainty that puts on stress on our system makes things hard to plan for shipping and moving commodities. And then the other one is educating the public. I don't know how many people I've met from the metro region that are like, we have shipping on the river here in Minnesota, or folks that have seen the barges and say, I saw those, what's in them? What's the deal with them? So we have been doing a fair amount to try and educate folks as well on the Mississippi River system. And one of the big efforts we did a few years ago, right before COVID, we had a launch party in February of 2020 for a video we did in partnership with Twin Cities Public Television called The Current State of Our Working River. And I sent these guys the link for it. So hopefully if you're interested, it's 26 minutes, fills a half-hour time slot. But it has some good information on the Mississippi River system as well. So hopefully that'll be in the comments if you're interested, or you can go on TPT's website and type in Working River, or I think it's called Current State of the River. And I'll follow up. Anyway, here's my information. Happy to entertain questions and turn things over. I see that I've gone long here as well.
That's all right. Well, we
turn it to Gina.
Sure. Well, thank you. And if you want to stop sharing. Great. And Deb, if you'd like to join us on camera, we have time for a couple of questions. And we'll give Catherine a minute to catch her breath. So the first question in the Q&A was around sort of passenger freight on, or not freight, passenger trips or vessels on the at the port. So if you just want to share a little bit maybe
Yep.
about that.
Look, I made a slide while Catherine was talking. So Cameron, yeah, we worked very hard with the city of Duluth and the Duluth Entertainment and Convention Center to be able to accept cruise vessels into the system. If you look at the history of the port in the 1800s through about probably, oh boy, anyway, in the early years of the port, what they called walking cargo was an important part of bringing tourists, but also business people and immigrants so we were very excited to get cruising up and moving again in 2022. What you see here is the Viking Octantis. So we actually have some international trips that start in Duluth and go outward from here. But now there's every year it's shifting a little bit, but the different cruise lines that come into the port. So
does that doesn't impact though the
No.
freight? Yeah.
No, there's it's not that busy of a harbor. There's not vessels. Yeah, it does not impact the cargo. And in fact, the dock wall is where they berth is
Embark.
right inside the harbor. It doesn't even get near the cargo portion of the harbor. Yeah, so.
Great. And then Cameron had another question, this one for Catherine. So since there isn't a waterfall on the Mississippi until you get to Minneapolis, what's the need for the locks and dams on the upper Mississippi? Is it mostly flood control and keeping the river to a certain depth?
Yes, so without the locks and dams, there would be areas of the river that were more swamp-like and only a couple feet deep before locks and dams were built. So they really do help keep the pool elevation so that it can be navigated to 9 feet. And that we have to do some maintenance dredging to keep that as well. But the lock and dams really do provide for a deeper depth than we would have without them.
Great, thank you. Well, we are right at time. So great presentations again. Thank you so much. And Catherine, we will include the link to the video on the CTS website along with the webinar and your slides. So
Thank you.
just again, a reminder, everyone, you're getting great information. So I hope you'll join the future webinars as well as we continue through the modes, discussing the different modes of freight that serve and the facilities that serve Minnesota. So with that, I am going to say thank you again to our presenters. Really, really great. Thank you for your efforts, and have a good day, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.